Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. My name is Jeremy Thompson. I'm the chairman of BALPA's Environment Study Group. And I'm here to present to you the first of a series of 4 of the symposia, which are a collaboration between BALPA and our air traffic control colleagues in GATCO, that's the Guild of Air Traffic Controllers. There's one of these sessions every Monday morning for the rest of January, so we've tried to pick topics that are of interest to both pilots and controllers, mostly to do with flight safety, and I do encourage you to tune in and listen to as many of them as you can. We're also going to record them all, and they'll be hosted on the websites of both BALPA and GATCO, so if you don't make them, you can see them online, and you can also send those links to any colleagues that you think may be interested. Presentation today is about one very specific subject, and that is contrail management. This is something that in the environment group we're working on very hard and we're very excited about. It has huge potential to mitigate the climate impact of aviation far more quickly and far more easily than trying to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. I'm really pleased to say we have some experts with us today. We're going to have 3 presentations. The first one is going to be from Professor Ian Pohl, Professor Emeritus at Cranfield University and an ex-chairman of the Royal Aeronautical Society. He's going to give you the outline of the concept and explain why it's so important. Following on from him, we have Dr. Roger Teoh, who is a member of research team at Imperial College, recently completed a PhD in exactly this subject. And he's going to explain contrail formation, why it matters for global warming, and all the different factors that are involved with formation and dissipation of contrails. Finally, we'll have James Vanderhoorn from the Environment Study Group, who's going to discuss the operational considerations with contrail management, how it affects both pilots and air traffic controllers, and what may need to change in the way we manage our flights in the future. During the presentation, please do ask questions. We absolutely encourage that, and there'll be time at the end where those questions will be put to our panel of experts. To do that, please use the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. You can use the chat function as well, but we won't be monitoring questions from there. That's just something you can use between yourselves if you wish. So if you'd like to pose a question, use the Q&A function. You can direct that question at one of the speakers specifically, or if you prefer, we'll set it to the panel as a whole. Well, let's kick off. I'd like to introduce to you Professor Ian Pohl.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. Let me say it's a pleasure to be able to talk to you this morning. I'm going to share some thoughts and hopefully provoke some interest and some questions. So I'll start by sharing my desktop. Hang on a minute, you are screen sharing. Where's my presentation gone? There we are. Is that visible now? Am I good to go?
It's working perfectly, and thank you.
Okay, right, thank you. So the question is, why should we aim to manage contrails? Before we get into that, let's have a quick run through the issues. What is global warming? Global warming is the important thing. This is the process that is potentially causing climate change and all the bad things that might go with it. So the Earth's mean temperature, the global mean temperature, is determined by a balance between incoming solar radiation, that shortwave stuff, and outgoing thermal radiation, the long-wave stuff. Anything that reduces the outgoing radiation, for example, increasing the amount of a greenhouse gas, increases the global mean temperature. Conversely, anything that reduces the incoming radiation, e.g. by changing the Earth's albedo or its reflectivity to sunlight, this will decrease GMT. So not all effects are bad. How does aviation affect the environment specifically? Well, aviation affects global warming by modifying radiative forcing. It does this in a number of ways. Firstly, the exhaust from the jet engine contains a mixture of nitrous and nitric oxide, commonly referred to as NOx. This modifies the concentration of existing greenhouse gases, ozone, and it reduces ozone, causing cooling, and methane, and it increases methane, causing a warming effect. Then there's the one we all know about, the CO2. That's a greenhouse gas. That's in the exhaust, and that causes warming. But then there is also water vapor, another greenhouse gas, and particulates from imperfect combustion that cause contrails in cold air at below -40 centigrade. And if the atmosphere is locally supersaturated with respect to ice, a persistent contrail and possibly contrail-induced cirrus clouds may form, and we'll call that C&CC just for shorthand. Now, C&CC may either warm or cool. So here's a nice picture. You all know what these things are like. On the left, we have in one image that I took myself, an aeroplane creating a persistent contrail and the evolving persistent contrails from aircraft that passed through that airspace previously. And you can see towards the bottom, it's starting to look cloud-like. And if you then look at the picture on the right, those are degenerate contrails. They look just like cirrus cloud. And there's the sun, just to show you that the sun shines on them. So aviation's current contribution shown in the usual way, the way the environmentalists love to present it. All the effects are shown as warming. So the current net effects are all warming, that's correct. And roughly the total given on the right-hand side is composed of 3 separate components. A sixth of the total is due to NOx, a third of the total is due to CO2, and a half is due to contrail and contrail-induced cirrus. So clearly, contrail and contrail-induced cirrus is believed to be the single largest contributor from aviation to the total radiative force and hence to global mean temperature change. This is not a well-known picture because, of course, everybody always focuses on CO2. CO2 emissions per annum. Now here I've shown the annual CO2 emissions in megatons from 1940 onwards. So this charts the rise of commercial aviation. And you can see we started at about 20 million tons per year in 1940, and now we're at over a gigaton per year in 2020. Now, off to the right, of course, there's a little bit of zinging about due to COVID, but nothing that seriously disrupts this upward trend. Now, the problem with CO2, and this is very important to appreciate, is that since the natural removal processes are slow, CO2 accumulates in the atmosphere. So the half-life for CO2 is about 30 years. So if you put in a dollop of CO2 today, then in 30 years, half of it will still be there. Unfortunately, the second half-life is hundreds of years. So dropping from a half to a quarter takes a couple of hundred years. And consequently, aviation-generated CO2 in the atmosphere today is about 60% of the sum total of CO2 emitted in all the flights since the Wright brothers began in 1903. So the aviation CO2 in the atmosphere today is the solid line. The dashed line is what you would get if the natural sequestration processes did not occur. So you can see nature's doing a pretty good job at taking the stuff out, but nevertheless, the aviation CO2 in the atmosphere today is around about 18 gigatons. So, as I've just said, 18 gigatons in the atmosphere today. Aviation, therefore, is responsible for about 0.5% of all the atmospheric CO2 from all sources. That's man-made and nature-made. It's 0.5% of the lot. And currently, CO2 aviations are about a gigaton per annum. So ops are increasing the total aviation CO2 by about 3.5% per annum right now, which means a doubling every 20 years. So by 2050, we'll have 50 gigatons in the atmosphere. if we don't do anything. So clearly CO2 is important. But, I should have said a but rather than and, if all the CO2 emissions were stopped tomorrow, the existing 18 gigaton pool would still be there. And that would only decrease to about 15 gigatons by 2050 through the natural sequestration processes. Therefore, removing carbon from aviation has little environmental benefit per se. What you're actually doing is just stopping the problem from getting worse. And some might argue that by not actually reducing environmental impact, the astronomical cost of removing CO2 from the aircraft is a very poor return on investment. So let's look at the current situation in a bit more detail. If we now separate contrail and contrail cirrus effects into their two constituent parts, we find that there are still three warming effects: NOx, CO2, and a branch of the contrail and contrail-induced cirrus. But one of the effects is now a cooling. So very roughly, and Roger will give you more detail on this, contrail and contrail-induced cirrus at night is the warmer. During the day, the impact of the cirrus cloud reflecting sunlight is so big that it produces a cooling effect. So the coolers are basically the contrail-induced cirrus that's got sunlight falling on it. Now you see, we have a slightly different and not so environmentally unfriendly picture, because one of our elements is blue. So let's say we went and eliminated all contrails. So we wouldn't worry about what they did, we would just stop forming them. That would halve the total radiative forcing overnight, because the effect of removing a contrail is instant. If you hold a mirror up to the sun and you take the mirror away, the effect stops immediately, unlike CO2, as we've already mentioned. So now, eliminate all contrails, you still have NOx, you still have CO2, but now the net contrail and contrail-induced cirrus is zero, hence the total is halved. Now that's a pretty big bite out of the problem for a relatively simple act. But let's be smarter than that, and this is where the managing of contrails comes in. Let's just eliminate the warming contrails and leave the coolers in place. Now we have a situation where NOx warms, CO2 warms, we've taken out the warming contrails and left the coolers in place, and hey presto, the net impact of aviation on global mean temperature is now zero. Wow. The environmentalists don't like to acknowledge this, by the way. And let's be even more proactive. Let's eliminate the warmers and let's make more coolers, because if we can manage contrails, then not only can we switch them off, but we can switch more of them on. So if we do that, we now have NOx warming, CO2 warming, but now extra cooling, and hey presto, the total environmental impact of aviation is now a cooling, therefore moving to reduce global mean temperature. So aviation might be able to move from being a strong contributor to global warming to either a near zero contributor or even a cooler. Even the sum total of all aviation CO2 emissions might be offset. Since radiative forcing of contrails and contrail cirrus is about 1.5 times aviation's current CO2, it's roughly equivalent to 27 gigatons of CO2 annually. Hence, the climate impact of contrails and contrail cirrus on a per flight basis is almost 30 times that of the flight's CO2 emission. Pretty impressive numbers, these. So the only problem is one of making or not making a contrail at will. Contrail management is completely within the control of the industry and its service providers. Initially, at least, no new technology or outside help is needed, not even from the airframe or engine manufacturers. The initial cost is probably small enough to be absorbed into current airline budgets. It's instantly effective. The impact can be monitored. It's ethical. It's low risk. It provides a mitigation against the risks of any problems with the non-arrival of new technology or issues with CORSIA. It's the only action that can reduce aviation's climate impact, and it has the potential to change the narrative for aviation completely. Why should the airlines take this seriously? Well, removing CO2 emissions does not reduce aviation's climate impact. If SAF, hydrogen and Wonder Kites don't appear on time, CORSIA offset program is the only backstop, and CORSIA is riddled with problems and uncertainties which add huge risk to airline balance sheets. So contrail management offers a simple, cheap, ethical way to mitigate the business risks of SAF, hydrogen, CORSIA. And since today there is no other plan B, airlines should appreciate the business potential of contrail management for risk reduction and PR, not to mention reducing aviation's contribution to global warming. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your time, Ian. I hope that presentation can demonstrate to everyone why we're so excited about this concept. The idea that we can do something quickly, cheaply and easily that halves the impact of flying on the environment is just astonishing. And there's even the potential in the future when we become experts at this, we can reduce it further and even become a global cooling effect from our emissions. So that's the concept. That's why it's important. The next speaker I'd like to introduce is Dr. Roger Teoh, who's been studying in great detail how aircraft contrails form, why they form, what conditions they form under, and how they dissipate, which is absolutely critical to understand if contrail management is going to work. So over to you, Roger.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Jeremy, for providing me with the opportunity to talk about our research. So today I'm going to talk about the science of contrails, the climate impacts, and what are the potential mitigation solutions that are available so far. Okay, so this is a slide, the figure that shows the aviation CO2 and non-CO2 pollutants. And as Professor Ian described in detail during his presentation earlier, I'm just only going to make the point that the effective radiator forcing of contrail cirrus could be higher than the cumulative CO2 emissions that has been emitted since the inception of aviation. So what are contrails? Contrails are line-shaped clouds that form behind an aircraft under favorable atmospheric conditions, for example, low temperatures and high humidity. So the aircraft soot, or the non-volatile particulate matter that's emitted behind the engine exhaust, primarily acts as a condensation nuclei, where water vapor condenses into this NVPM particles, and they subsequently freeze to form contrail ice crystals. Therefore, you see the line-shaped clouds that form behind an aircraft, predominantly formed by ice crystals. So this aircraft NVPM number emissions index, in other words, is the number of NVPM particles that has been emitted per kilogram of fuel burn. It is a very critical parameter that influences various control properties and its lifetime. For example, based on models, and this has been demonstrated and shown to be consistent with measurements, it shows that as you increase the NVPM particles, the number emissions index, the number of contrail ice crystals increases, has a very strong positive correlation relative to the NVPM particles. And for example, if you reduce the NVPM particles, the contrail ice crystals tend to grow larger because think about it, like you have a fixed humidity in the air parcel, and it is distributed to less particles. Therefore, the control ice particles grow larger in size. This size factor here is very important because it affects the sedimentation rate of the control ice crystals, and therefore larger control ice crystals tend to have a shorter lifetime. Next here, it's the optical depth. So what do I mean by optical depth is that if you have a higher optical depth, it means that the contrails that you see in the sky is more visible and they're thicker. So as you increase the NVPM number emissions index, the contrails tend to be thicker, and that has to be that will influence the climate impact of the contrail cirrus, the optical depth term. So yeah, I've mentioned that the aircraft NVPM number emissions index here, it affects different control properties. And what I'm showing you here, it's a bit small. I'm showing you the NVPM number emissions index, the emissions profile for different aircraft engine types. On the y-axis is the NVPM number emissions index. The x-axis is the engine thrust settings from engine idle during taxiing to engine takeoff conditions on the x-axis. So for different aircraft engine types, there are significant variations in the NVPM emissions profile So let's take the Airbus A320 for example. You can see it can be powered by two different engine options: the CFM engine or the IAE engines, which has the IAE engines can have the NVPM emissions can be up to an order of magnitude larger than the CFM equivalent. On the other hand, you can see there's this Boeing 787 as well that can be powered by the GE NX twin annular swirl pre-mixing swirler and combustor, or the Rolls-Royce Trent engine. And you can see with different combustor technologies, the NVPM emissions can vary by up to 4 to 5 orders of magnitude. Across all aircraft engine types, you can see that the NVPM number emissions index can range from 10 to 11 to 10 to the 16 particles per kilogram of fuel burn. And all these information is publicly available from the ICAO Aircraft Emissions Data Bank. So again, this is a very critical input parameter for different control models. Okay, I've described the formation of contrails. So contrails persist when the atmosphere is supersaturated with respect to ice. And when they persist, they spread into a larger area and transition into contrail cirrus that is generally indistinguishable relative to natural cirrus clouds. So here's an example of the satellite image that's been published in one of the journal papers here. You see coil-shaped contrails. They're likely formed by military aircraft, were initially identified off the east coast of the UK. And over time, these contrails gradually lose their line-shaped structure and become indistinguishable from natural cirrus clouds. And yeah, after 10 hours, it spreads to a very large area and drifts towards the southwest of the UK. So how does contrail impact the climate? There are two components, as Professor Ian Pohl mentioned briefly in his talk. During the day, contrails can reflect incoming solar radiation and could cause a cooling effect. However, at all times during the day, contrails also trap the outgoing long-wave radiation that is emitted from the surface of the Earth, and it reflects the heat back to the surface, therefore causing a greenhouse effect. And based on the current scientific consensus so far, the contrail net effect is a warming effect. Okay, now I'm just going to briefly introduce two different metrics that is available to estimate or to quantify the contrail climate forcing. The first one is the contrail net radiative forcing. So this is the most commonly used metric. This is the change in instantaneous radiative flux over a defined area at one point in time. So it has units of watts per meter squared. And yeah, if the outgoing long wave radiation is 3 watts and you're reflecting 1 watt of incoming solar radiation, then yeah, the net effect is 2 watts per meter squared. So the second term here, it's less. Okay, this radiative forcing term is generally used to quantify the contrail climate forcing over a defined spatial domain for contrails that are formed by a fleet of aircraft. Different, yeah. Whereas for the energy forcing, this is the cumulative energy that is trapped in the atmosphere by individual contrails. And we generally use this to quantify the contrail climate forcing from individual flights. So how do we calculate this contrail energy forcing? In other words, we calculate it by multiplying the local contrail radiative forcing, which is the change in energy flux divided by the contrail area. And we multiply it with the dimensions, the contrail length and the width, and integrate it over its lifetime to get the cumulative effects. 2 main points I would like to make here. For short-lived contrails, you can have a very, very large radiative forcing, but like the overall climate effect is small because short-lived contrails have a very small coverage area, and yeah, therefore the energy forcing is small and it's insignificant. On the other hand, like if contrails are long-lived, say for example it survives up to 10 hours, the radiative forcing can be very small, but because it spreads, it has already spread to a very large coverage area. These will contribute to a very, very large contrail energy forcing, and these are the problematic contrails that we need to address. So just a brief summary of methods on like how we perform our simulations, our research simulations here. First, we need an air traffic data set. As you can see here, this is a data set for the world, which we derive the flight trajectories from ADS-B data. We then need to estimate the aircraft performance, for example, the fuel consumption, the engine thrust settings, and the overall propulsion efficiency, which will affect the formation of contrails. Once we have the fuel consumption and engine thrust settings, we can estimate the emissions, in particular, the NVPM, the non-volatile particulate matter, the number emissions index, which is a critical parameter for contrail models. And together, we need for meteorological data, which we obtain it from the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasts. And we input the emissions and the meteorological data to a contrail model, which is the contrail cirrus prediction model, COSIP, developed by the German Aerospace Center. We get the contrail, so it provides us with data such as the output, such as the simulated contrail formation, the different contrail properties, how long does the contrail live, and the two climate metrics, in particular the radiative forcing and the energy forcing. And with this model that's available, we explore different implications for mitigation. So there are 3 strategies that we are looking at right now. Flight diversion strategies. For example, we reroute flights around contrail susceptible regions to minimize the formation of persistent warming contrails. Or you could use sustainable aviation fuel, of course, but the supply remains limited right now. In other words, when you use sustainable aviation fuel, you can reduce the NVPM number emissions index by up to an order of magnitude, thereby reducing the contrail lifetime and climate forcing. Or the third option is you could use cleaner burning engines, which it will gradually be like cleaner engines will gradually be introduced to the fleet over time. And yeah, that reduces the NVPM number emissions index as well, and it reduces the contrail climate forcing. Here's an example of the COSIP control model in action for the global contrail simulation. So this is currently work in progress. It's not published right now. Yeah, we hope to get these global results published in a few months. What you see here is that COSIP simulates the individual contrail segments that are produced by individual flights from formation to its end of life. And you can see how the contrails advect over time. And during the night here, it's generally warming. And during the day, it can be cooling or it could be warming. So it's about 50-50. Here's an example of the global annual mean contrail cirrus net radiative forcing. Again, it's still work in progress and we hope to get this published soon. we see that the global annual mean contrail cirrus net radiative forcing is about 72.2 milliwatts per meter squared. And that's approximately double of the aviation cumulative CO2 emissions since its inception. So this is the annual mean contrail cirrus net radiative forcing. So we're comparing 1 year of the contrail climate forcing relative to the cumulative impacts of the aviation CO2 emissions. And still, the annual mean contrail cirrus net radiative forcing is double of that of the CO2 emissions. So if we break it down into regions, we see that Europe has the largest contrail climate forcing, approximately 1 watt per meter squared. And the reason for that is because of its high latitude and a very high air traffic density, which is like one of the densest airspace across the world. And the United States as well is the second highest at 440 milliwatts per meter squared, followed by the North Atlantic and Southeast Asia. So what you're seeing here in this slide is the percentage of flight distance forming persistent contrails. Globally, approximately 40% of all flights form contrails, but only about 5% of the annual flight distance flown forms persistent contrails. And you can see here the North Atlantic in particular, and over like Central Europe, over Russia. This is 2019. So yeah, these regions, North Atlantic and Central Europe, they have a high proportion of flight distance forming contrails, because at these airspace, the aircraft are generally at cruising altitudes, rather than and there's less air traffic activity at climb and descent. What we see here, what we think here, if you see in the Central Europe section, I think they're mainly flights that are traveling from Asia to Europe. But maybe this could be different in 2022 because the Russian airspace is now not being used by most airlines. Okay, so 5% of annual flight distance form persistent contrails, not much. If we look into like the regional statistics, what I would like to show here is that approximately, if we look at the North Atlantic, 12% of all flights in the North Atlantic account for 80% of the annual contrail energy forcing. And if you look at the Japan region, which is published in a paper 3 years ago, only 2.2% of all flights over Japan accounted for 80% of the total contrail energy forcing. If we look at it, the global results, which is not published yet, it's approximately 3%. And one of the reasons for this discrepancy is that, as you know, over the North Atlantic, the flight trajectories, the flights tend to follow an organized track structure. So they're following behind each other. So if one contrails, if one flight, for example, if the flight ahead of it is expected to form a contrail, then all the flights behind it following the same flight trajectory and the same track structure, they're expected to form contrails. Therefore, you get a higher proportion of flights forming accounting for 80% of the contrail energy forcing over the North Atlantic. Whereas in Japan, because it's more free fall, there's more variability in the flight trajectories. Therefore, you get a smaller percentage of all flights forming 80% of the contributing 80% of the contrail energy forcing. So, what are the factors influencing and affecting the contrail climate forcing? There are 4 main factors, and if we look at the North Atlantic, let's say the first 2 factors is the seasonal effect and diurnal effects. Okay, this plot, what you see in this plot is the contrail cirrus net radiative forcing for each hour in 2019. So the y-axis is each of the day, 365 days in 2019. The x-axis is the UTC time over the North Atlantic. And you can see during the winter, because of the shorter daylight hours, because of the lower temperatures, contrails tend to be more persisting. You get a higher contrail lifetime. And because of the shorter daylight hours, you get less cooling effect, smaller daylight hours, less cooling effect. Whereas during the summer, you tend to get more cooling effect during the day because of the longer daylight hours. And again, during the day, maybe approximately 30 to 40% of the time, contrails are cooling, not 100%. two additional factors that contributes to the factors influencing the contrail climate forcing. The third one is whether the contrails are formed above or below natural cirrus clouds. So contrails tend to be more warming if they are formed above thick natural cirrus clouds, and yeah, contrails tend to be less warming if there's natural cirrus above the contrail. And I'm not going to go through the exact science of it, but it's published in the paper that's cited below. And the final factor here is we've talked about this in the presentation earlier, and it's the aircraft NVPM emissions. And as I've mentioned here, if you have a higher NVPM number, higher NVPM particles, you tend to form smaller contrail ice particles. And because the sedimentation rate of smaller contrail ice particles are smaller, you tend to increase the contrail lifetime. Because you have the higher NVPM particles as well, you increase the contrail optical depth. And just to summarize everything, a higher NVPM particle emissions leads to a higher contrail energy forcing per flight distance. So 3 mitigation strategies, just to briefly summarize it because I'm running out of time. The first option is cleaner burning engines. What we've seen here, and like for different papers, is that, for example, if you reduce the NVPM number emissions index by about 70%, you can reduce the contrail energy forcing by about 45% to 80%. But again, the fleet-wide adoption of cleaner burning engines takes time because a typical aircraft, the lifetime for an aircraft tends to be about 20 to 30 years. So the new technology takes a long time for it to diffuse into the fleet. The next option is sustainable aviation fuel, and that reduces the NVPM number emissions index. However, we know that currently the supply of sustainable aviation fuel is scarce. So it's right now, I think it's less than 1% of the global annual fuel supply that's available as SAF. However, our recent publication that has been published about 2 months ago, it shows that because not all flights form contrails, and some contrails can be strongly warming, if you target the limited supply of SAF to transatlantic flights with strongly warming contrails, even, for example, if you assume that 1% of the global fuel supply is available as SAF, and you targeted transatlantic flights with strongly warming contrails, you can reduce the contrail energy forcing by up to 10%. Therefore, you multiply the environmental benefit, the climate benefits of SAF, in addition to the CO2 life cycle benefits. The third one is flight diversion strategies. This is a bit tricky because if you're diverting 1.7, when you divert 1.7% of the flights, you can reduce the contrail energy forcing over Japan by about 50 to 65%. But it's a bit tricky because you need to account for the different operational constraints. For example, air traffic management and meteorological forecasts, which I'll describe in the next slide, my last slide. And yeah, this is how flight diversion strategy would work, for example, over the North Atlantic. You could formulate the organized track structure based on the projected ice supersaturated regions and account for the trade-off between the fuel consumption and the contrail climate impact. So just briefly going through the challenges of flight diversion strategies. As you can see here on the different plots is the meteorological forecast of the ice supersaturated region over the North Atlantic. And what you see here, like how you can see how the ice supersaturated region, the forecast ice supersaturated region changes over time from 96, when we forecast it 96 hours ahead of time, up to the actual ice supersaturated region that has been observed. So yeah, you need to account for this meteorological forecast, and like perhaps we should file the flight trajectory. And for example, if you're formulating the organized track structure over the North Atlantic, you should do it as close to the flight time as possible to minimize the uncertainties. And you need to account for the different air traffic management constraints and the potential trade-offs, for example, in terms of the fuel penalty and additional CO2 emissions. On the other hand, maybe arguably, the use of sustainable aviation fuel might be easier to implement, because even if you get the meteorological and contrail forecasting wrong, you still get the net benefit from the CO2 life cycle emissions, the reduction in CO2 life cycle emissions. So, okay, just to summarize my talk so far, the contrail radiator forcing, the NO mean, could be higher than the RF from aviation's cumulative CO2 emissions since its inception, but with large uncertainties. Contrails can persist, spread, and evolve into contrail cirrus. The four main factors influencing the contrail climate forcing is the diurnal and seasonal effects, the background cloud fields, and the aircraft-specific NVPM emissions. And there are 3 contrail mitigation strategies that are available. For example, the use of cleaner burning engines, use of sustainable aviation fuel, and flight diversion strategies. So yep, that's the end of my talk, and I'll pass it back to Jeremy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Teoh. That's really interesting and detailed talk. I think that demonstrates just how complicated this subject can be, but at the same time, the better we understand all the factors that affect contrail formation and dissipation, the more accurately we can target flights. A lot of people, when they're introduced to this concept, have a natural reaction that it's impractical, that we can't afford the fuel to cause lots of flight diversions vertically and horizontally. We don't have the airspace to support it and so on. But I think understanding it to the sort of level that Dr. Teoh is showing there will allow us to focus much more accurately on the key flights that matter and ignore far more. And we are actually looking at only a few % of flights being affected. However, there are still important air traffic control factors to consider, as well as fuel consumption. In other words, there are operational impacts. And to look at that, how that might work for us, we're going to have James Vanderhoorn make a presentation looking at air traffic control, flight crew, how they can work together with flight planning departments in airlines and try and make this a reality. Over to you, James.
Good morning, everyone. Hello, I'm James Vanderhoorn. Thanks for tuning in to let me hear to talk about the pilot's perspective on contrails. I should state up front that I'm not an environmental expert like the other two. I started this environmental journey about 4 or 5 years ago. It's just something which I'm very passionate in. So I don't really know what background everyone who's tuned in is from, so I apologize in advance if I'm teaching you to suck eggs a little bit. So see how we get on, and obviously ask any questions at the end if you have any interesting questions. I'll try to share my screen. No, it does. Excellent. So, talking about the pilot's perspective and the operational view, and am I still there? Right. The first thing flight begins with, as I'm sure a lot of you know, is an error that's come up on my screen. Hopefully, still presenting. Sorry about a technical error. It just said that my Zoom is disconnected. So I'm trying sharing my screen again. Might have just connected me back in. Sorry about that. A laptop issue. Let's try again. Great. Okay, here we go. So first thing that I'm sure a lot of you know is the flight plan. So how are they produced? The flight plans are all automatically produced by the airline's flight planning system, and the most optimum flight level is chosen for a given weight and speed. What timeline are they produced on? So the flight plan is typically produced on the day of the flight, and it's then revised a few times before the time of departure. These revisions take into account a long list of factors, including tailwinds or headwinds, air traffic control charges, potential weather issues, air traffic control strikes, terrain, and war zones. By the time we check in, 17 minutes before departure, there may have been about 10 different iterations. So what's the latest that we can accept the new route before departure? Approximately 1 hour before the estimated off-box time, the route is finalized. But even that can be adjusted and a new route or level given by the flight planners in the case of thunderstorms causing slot delays or even air traffic control restrictions or strikes which might be limiting traffic. Sometimes we call the flight planners proactively and we ask if they can give us an alternative route to avoid the delays. And very occasionally they'll proactively call us or send us an email asking if we'd like to change our route. Either way, we then program the aircraft with a new route and it's set to go about 45 minutes before the flight. Occasionally there are flight level restrictions due to performance. And with regards to how easy it is to change the flight level and the increased workload once we're up there in the cruise, basically, I just wanted to let the air traffic controllers who are here know that it's not really a big event at all. So when ATC discussed flying or descend, and provided there are no performance limitations associated with a higher level, for example, with too heavy, simply just action their request. And whilst we make our best efforts to cruise at the optimum altitude, as you can see on the FMGC here, it's very frequent for pilots to be flying at 1,000 or even 3,000 feet off their optimum altitude. And that could be due to changing outside air temperature, varying headwinds, varying tailwinds, or crossing traffic. Here's the FMGC from a flight actually operated to Athens just a few weeks ago, just to illustrate the point that we frequently don't fly at the optimum altitude for a given weight or speed. In this case, we're cruising at flight level 350, as you can see in the top left of that box, and the optimum was 1,000 feet higher at 360, and our operating ceiling at the time was flight level 377. But it's not uncommon for the optimum altitude to be 380, and we're still stuck at flight level 350. So something I wanted to point, which you may have heard this before, but I really want to try and impress everyone, that avoiding contrails laterally does not always involve extra fuel burn, especially if they're amended at the flight planning phase. Here's a flight plan which was barred for a flight which I did back from Athens a couple of weeks ago. And you can very clearly see that it's not the most fuel efficient route. That's because airlines, understandably, prefer to take the most cost optimized routing and not the most climate optimized routing. And they take into account several factors, including air traffic management charges. So I wanted you to think about a piece of string. So if you think of a piece of string between A and B, ignoring wind components for a moment, the least fuel burn route between 2 points is always going to be a straight line. But in reality, there's quite a lot of slack in the system, which results in hundreds of different permutations of how that flight can make its way to its destination. Now, let's assume there's a region of supersaturated air somewhere over Europe. By using software such as that by Satavia or Flight Keys, the lateral flight plan can then be adjusted at the planning phase to be climate optimized rather than cost optimized, with no excess fuel burn. So this is the shortest route between A and B, whereas here are potentially climate optimized routes with no excess fuel burn. The length of string is the same in each one of those cases, as you can see there. The fuel burn is the same in each one of those cases. In many cases, the navigation charges are also the same in each one of those cases. Honeywell flight planning system has a long list of inputs which it uses to come up with the route. And the finalized plan we end up programming into the FMGC is just one of many different permutations. If the lateral deviation is considered to be too significant, well, I've just shown on the last slide that we frequently fly off our optimum level. So we could also deviate vertically to avoid contrails with little or no fuel penalty above and beyond what we already do. Finally, I've overlaid the actual flight path that we ended up taking on that day on flight radar, which is that green piece of string. So hopefully this helps just to hit points that even on a typical day, a couple of weeks ago, it's incredibly rare that we fly a published flight plan, which is the line behind it. And we certainly very rarely, if ever, fly minimum fuel routes. So we need to start leaning towards climate optimized flight planning rather than cost optimized flight planning. Personally, I've never seen a flight plan with a direct route at optimum altitude with no tankering fuel, alone at the most fuel efficient speed, which is cost index 0. So clearly there are several fuel savings which are not being exploited. And at the moment, avoiding these contrails, these contrail reducing regions, is just considered an extra problem by the airlines. And it's definitely not considered a requirement, and nobody at the moment is considering it as an opportunity. There could always be an option for airlines to disregard the climate optimal profile if they consider that the fuel burn for the different flight path is above a certain threshold. For example, if it's 1% more, they could just revert to the initial plan. The point is that the technology is now mature enough that this can be done at the flight planning phase with a degree of accuracy which is high enough to make a meaningful difference to the climate. So what can we see as pilots? Another point which has been raised quite regularly is that pilots can be used to make cockpit reports on other aircraft contrails. Or perhaps we can use onboard cameras or even mirrors to see if we're leaving any contrails behind us. These reports can then be fed back to the modeling system and update subsequent flight plans for the aircraft which are still on the ground. The problem with that is that it's very difficult to see if we determine if the contrail that we're seeing behind the aircraft is genuinely a long-lived contrail or a short or medium-lived contrail. So it's just simply not a reliable system for a pilot to classify how significant a contrail is. And when you consider that the contrails that we're hoping to minimize the most are those which are produced in the evening and overnight, basically using pilots to classify contrails is just not a very good idea. However, the flip side of that is that if an aircraft is flying through a region of supersaturated air where a contrail is expected to be produced, but they can clearly see that nothing is forming behind them, then this negative contrail report can be used to update the models. So Roger mentioned a little bit on his paper, the design principles for contrail minimizing trial in the North Atlantic. So I just wanted to give a few points on this. It's worth noting that flight diversion strategies to avoid contrail producing regions doesn't require the flight planning team to avoid all the contrails. 70% of contrails over the North Atlantic are short-lived, and 20% of them have a cooling effect. That leaves only 10% which need to be targeted, which is a very small number. I mean, he also spoke about the Japan trial, but we're looking here at just the North Atlantic trial. So with regards to the 4 strategies which outlined in that paper, the strategy which jumps out initially as the most promising from a pilot perspective is called the alternate flight profile strategy, whereby in scenarios where the contrail forecast is determined to have a higher degree of uncertainty, then 2 different flight level profiles are protected by the air navigation service provider. The lateral element of the flight path could then be finalized 24 hours before departure, and the vertical profile tactically optimized by air traffic control right up to the entry point of when the aircraft gets to the nav track. The provisional flight plan would include the necessary fuel for the most restrictive of the 2 flight plans, and after departure, the contrail forecast could then be rerun and the optimal flight profile finalized with a greater level of certainty and the relevant flight level clearance given at the entry point to the NATS track. This allows for the most up-to-date contrail avoidance data to be used with a minimal increased workload for the flight crew. And as I mentioned previously, lateral revisions are slightly more time-consuming to pilots than vertical revisions. Another interesting fact on the screen here is the second bullet point, that level changes across the NATS track are only accepted 11% of the time. That's 15% for eastbound flights and 7% for westbound flights. The first question you're going to ask is why? And often it's because of reasons as simple as it's smooth to currently flying at the same level. So let's just stay at the level we're at the moment. And it's worth noting also that NATS have a system called Request Monitor, whereby they can see whether a climb is within the performance range of an aircraft, and they'll only ever offer it to a pilot if they know that the aircraft is capable of achieving it. The saturated regions of air tend to only be between 2,000 and 2,500 feet thick in depth and about 80 nautical miles long. And aircraft over the Atlantic frequently fly off their optimum level for hours at a time. Yet to avoid the hard-hitting contrail-producing regions would only require level deviations of about 15 to 30 minutes at most before they could return back to their previous level. So is there an appetite for change? Well, the biggest challenge we face implementing such a trial at the moment is a lack of incentives for airlines to get behind them. As I'm sure you know, aviation is incredibly competitive and airlines do everything they can to reduce their costs. So unless they're forced to change their SOPs through regulation or policy, there's no operator out there that wants to increase their costs without something back in return. And as Professor Pohl pointed out, the additional trip fuel required to avoid these ice regions can potentially even be negative, and in worst case scenarios, only a couple of %. But the thing we need to worth thinking about is that we don't have to get it 100% correct from day one. We shouldn't be letting the perfect be the enemy of just the good. Even if just a very small proportion of contrail avoiding flights are successful in reducing the radiative forcing, we're still affecting a massive amount of positive change. Then over time, as the models improve and we finesse our methodology for avoiding the regions, it's only going to get better and better. But we'd say that it's better to learn while we're doing it, rather than just watching from the sidelines for another decade or two, trying to identify the ISS regions with 100% accuracy, whilst the global mean temperature is just steadily increasing. Through working with regulators and the government, BALPA and IFALPA hope to encourage airlines to start flying minimum climate impact routes rather than cost impact routes, with air navigation service providers reducing their charges if airlines choose to actively adjust their level or their route to less climate impactful profiles, with the initial funding either provided by trials, the government, or ultimately at some point, maybe the passengers. At the end of the day, we believe the government policy is wrong because it's only focusing on CO2 emissions and not the global mean temperature. And that's the thing which is driving climate change. Before I finish, I want to bring up a picture of a bridge. I'm sure a lot of you recognize that as the Forth Bridge. And due to its size, it used to take 5 years to paint from one end to the other. And as soon as the workers got to the end, they had to go back to the beginning and start painting again. And there's a saying in English, when something takes a really long time, it's like painting the Forth Bridge. Well, that's what we see every single day in the skies across the UK, across Europe, and across the North Atlantic. And here we can see it across the east coast of America as well. They're repainting the sky every single day at contrails, which are causing a much bigger impact than CO2. So my final slide is that contrail avoidance has the potential to reduce aviation's climate impact by at least half. It can be applied to the entire worldwide fleet, whatever its level of technology. It's not just the low-hanging fruit that we've heard about from the other two presenters here. It's literally the lowest hanging fruit available to the entire aviation industry. That fruit is now ripe. And whilst I'm not an environmental scientist like the professor and the doctor we've heard, I think the scientific community has come to the conclusion now that the level of certainty is sufficiently high that the opportunity is just truly gigantic. Contrail avoidance schemes and policies could be effective worldwide many years before yet to be developed technologies such as SAFs from renewable have penetrated any significant proportion of worldwide aviation. So at BALPA and at IFALPA, we're both supportive of a large-scale trial to be implemented without delay across the North Atlantic track and Europe. So that's the end, and thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I look forward to any questions you might.
Thank you very much, James. I think that just goes to show, again, just what potential contrail management has and how important it is that pilots, air traffic controllers and the operating companies work together to realise that potential. Well, big thank you to our three presenters. We're going to move on to questions now. And thank you for sending the questions in as well. The first one I have here, I think probably best asked to Ian, although James may be able to address it too. So fundamentally, how do you plan to avoid contrails? If by changing flight levels, does the added CO2 with a half-life of 30 years not create more issues than a contrail that goes away in a few hours? And just backing that up, how do you plan to check the results after performing the flight? Do you want to tackle that first, Ian?
Well, I think James described it beautifully in his talk. You know, there is no
Ian,
proof.
muted. We can't hear you.
Oh.
It's me.
Oh, it says on mute here.
That's better.
You're working it.
Am I back?
Yep, that's working.
Very good. Okay, I was just about to say that I think James answered that question comprehensively in his talk, that it seems to be a popular misconception that an optimum route means minimum fuel, whereas it actually means economically optimum. And there's an awful lot of wriggle room in there that allows you to include contrail. I'm going to use contrail management. It's not contrail avoidance. We don't want a situation where aircraft come along that don't make contrails, because you know the long-term vision is to use the more coolers in order to offset aviation's the irreversible climate impact of aviation due to the CO2 that's already been emitted. And if we make that a target, then you really do want to be able to make contrails occasionally as well as avoid them. So any argument that says that, oh, well, SAF doesn't make contrails is actually not helpful. And it's not a positive argument for SAF. It's a point against SAF, in my view. But let James answer the direct questions again, because I think he had all of this in his talk.
Well, the second part, how do you plan to check the results in overcast skies? Well, we wouldn't be doing contrail avoidance if there's overcast skies, as far as I'm aware. I think if it's forecast to be cloudy days, we wouldn't be doing contrail avoidance. It's more clear air days.
You know, the big hitters are when you've got a clear sky above the contrails, the sun's blazing. It's like, I mean, it's not rocket science. You can almost see the best conditions with your own eyes. You know, it's not hidden. But the other thing is that there are now satellites in orbit up there that can monitor the amount of radiation that's been reflected as well as being transmitted from the Earth's surface. So basically, you can see the effect in the sensors that are already up there, and you know, this measuring, monitoring, and assessing is already going on at a preliminary level, and of course that's part of the learning process. So the short answer is, if it's working, we can prove it.
Yeah, and I think the impact of the contrail, removing that contrail, is more significant than the impact of the CO2 of the extra fuel level, the flight level change over 30 years. So it's better to avoid that contrail, a persistent long-term contrail for radiative forcing, than that extra tiny bit of fuel that you're going to be burning.
That's right.
Flight level.
In my slide, James, the ratio is 27 times. Okay, so the benefit of hitting the contrail is 27 times better than the impact of the carbon dioxide. You know, I mean, these are not small numbers, these are massive. So, you know, even if there is uncertainty, which of course there is, it's not enough to offset benefit. The level of benefit may vary depending on how things play out, but at no point is there an argument that says it isn't worth doing. You know, the uncertainty bounds are not that large.
Ian, there's one more point that I know you like to make as well. Like we are missing the key point is that, like, if you divert the flights, it's not necessarily a fuel penalty. You could have fuel savings as well.
Yes, of course.
The
yeah.
wind conditions.
Yeah, there is only one, each aircraft at a given weight has only one Mach number and altitude pair at which the fuel burn is an absolute minimum. And aircraft rarely, if ever, get anywhere near that point. And it's only if you're on that point that a deviation increases fuel. If you're anywhere else, then a deviation might or might not increase fuel. And obviously, if you have the might not option, then you would go for it.
Thank you very much. Another question also for Professor Pohl. If we're deliberately creating cooling contrails and avoiding making warming contrails, people may complain that this is a form of geoengineering. What are your thoughts on that? Okay,
that's an easy one. In pre-industrial atmosphere, there are no contrails. So the geoengineering has already taken place. The 50% of aviation total impact due to contrails is geoengineering. So my argument would be that by exploiting something that you already do, you are not creating an additional problem. And if you simply took out all the contrails, which would be the crudest and least subtle option, you would in fact return the sky to its pre-industrial state. So, you know, that's the argument. You can have a pre-industrial state sky, but that wouldn't be the best way to exploit the opportunity that we now have. So you finesse it. It's, as I say, the geoengineering has already taken place. anything we do now is tinkering with the geoengineering.
Thanks, Ian. A question which may be best directed to Roger. Someone is asking, what about the use of electric engines? Has there been any advancement in research on the use of electric engines for aircraft? And what impact would this have on contrails? Would they still form at all?
Okay, this is a tricky question, but which I think the literature has not, we don't really have much materials in the literature right now, but based on like the current science that we know, electric aircraft do not emit any NVPM non-volatile particles. So any contrails, and yeah, not sure if they have like the water vapor emissions index as well, probably not, no water vapor emissions. So it only depends on the ambient humidity and the background particles, which could form contrails. But I don't think they should. I don't think they'll be long-lived. If they form contrails, they're most likely to be short-lived and have a low climate impact.
Could I just come in on that?
Yep.
Electric aeroplanes, it's not clear where they would actually fly. In other words, there's no, the reason that current aircraft fly at around 35,000 feet is due to a combination of the characteristics of the aircraft and the characteristics of the engine. Now, an electric engine does not look anything like or behave anything like a gas turbine, and therefore the optimum altitude for an electric aircraft will not be at the same point as a gas turbine. And clearly, if it's considerably lower, which you would expect it to be perhaps, then you won't have the supersaturated air regions at all. So you know, it's not an issue. But then, of course, going back to my point, is that you've taken away an opportunity. You know, it's not necessarily a good outcome. And I suppose the other comment is electric aircraft are only going to be on the sub 1,000 kilometer routes in the foreseeable future. So it's only very short ranges that are taken out.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. That's a very good point. And yeah, if we talk about the aircraft altitude, if you look at turboprop aircraft, they don't generally form contrails as it is, because they generally don't fly above 25,000 feet. So we should expect the same for electric aircraft if their cruise altitude is low.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys. Obviously, that doesn't address the fundamental problem that whether electrically driven aircraft will ever be practical for mass passenger transport. But let's not go off on a tangent. I have another question, which either of our academic spokesmen could answer. Is there data from the COVID period where there were far fewer flights and fewer contrails, especially across the Atlantic, that shows the environmental benefit of reduced contrails?
Yeah, I guess I'll just give a brief comment on that. Yeah, there are studies, there are papers that use satellite images and look at the change in the contrail cirrus coverage and the variations in the surface temperature. However, because as expected by the models, the difference in the change in the surface temperature is very small, and it's within the day-to-day variability of the surface temperature. Therefore, we can't really extract a strong signal yet. There's no strong signal supporting the reduction in temperature, but because it's within the variability of the surface temperature changes.
But there is a strong signal, Roger, showing that the contrails weren't there,
Yes.
and that the cloud cover wasn't as dense
right.
as it normally. In other words, the secondary indicators are all aligned with the concept that when the aircraft are present, they are doing something which is not good. So the short answer to that question is there is now 2 years worth of information where the amount of aircraft traffic is very low. That's an absolute godsend, because all we had before was 2 days when 9/11 closed the airspace. And it's, you know, basically analyzing that data is a work in progress that could go on for years. But as far as I'm aware, correct me if I'm wrong, Roger, the initial findings are that contrails are every bit as bad as we think they are.
Yeah, you're right. In terms of the reduction in the contrail cirrus coverage area, yes, we see a reduction. Temperature-wise, probably there's a reduction, but again, because it's within the noise, yeah,
Well,
it's not. Yeah,
temperature's too difficult at this stage to be, you know, as you say, it's too difficult. But if the macroscopic effects are there and obvious, then the chances are that that is finding its way down into temperature.
I agree with you.
Thanks very much. This is a question a little bit more on the operational side, so I'll direct it to James. Given that this forum is a GATCO BALPA collaboration, he wants to know what can ATCOs do to support the contrail challenge? And also, could something like pirates be used to other pilots to help?
Well, directly, the ATCOs can't do a huge amount since it's the airlines which do flight planning. However, they could facilitate reduced charges for airlines which choose to go for climate optimized routing. So if a route is specifically chosen to go longer because it's reducing the charges by the air navigation provider, then they need to adjust the cost to go through different parts of airspace so that it's an incentivized basically for the airlines to go through a route which is more climate optimized. That makes sense. And the follow-up part of that, the question has disappeared.
Pirates.
Pirates. I think I mentioned earlier that reporting whether we don't produce a contrail is more important than reporting whether we do produce a contrail, because our ability to report whether a contrail is a 12-hour contrail or a 30-minute contrail is not very good, to be honest. But if we can say whether a contrail is not there when we think it, well, the science says that it should be, then that's much more beneficial in updating the model. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you, James. I've got a message from Pete Clark. It's not a question as such, but it's a very interesting point. He says that he presumes we're aware that the Maastricht Upper Air Centre did run a trial on contrail avoidance in 2021 and had similar findings that contrails tended to be positive effect on the climate up to about 4 p.m. and that they're going to run another trial soon. And that's an interesting point. That trial was done. Unfortunately, the timing was quite poor because it tended to coincide with the COVID period and the vastly reduced traffic. It was also quite a limited trial that didn't have the best study design. So we haven't learned a whole lot from that Eurocontrol trial in the Maastricht upper airspace. We do hope that the next trial will prove more fruitful in terms of validating the ideas. And it also is worth mentioning that it's not just us pushing this concept. Things are starting to happen really quite rapidly now. So in the USA, there's a new group called the Contrail Impact Task Force, which has recently been unveiled. And that brings together some very large operators, airline manufacturers, academics, and some serious funding. So they are taking it very seriously in the US at the moment. We also are in touch with a few companies that provide the flight planning services and help with analysis, such as Satavia, which James mentioned earlier. And they're working with Etihad and Lufthansa, amongst others, to actually provide the flight planning tools, do the contrail management, and assess whether it is successful. So we're getting actually really quite close, I would say, beyond the proof of concept point to the proof that it can work in an operational scenario as well. Do any of our three panelists want to talk about trials that have happened or that should happen and what we could hope to learn from them? So no, Ian's going.
No, I'm just trying to unmute myself. Yes, I mean, there are two kinds of trial here, aren't there? There's one kind which provides scientific evidence, and that's really, really complicated. But the other kind of trial is one where you just simply see if the operation system in which you work can accommodate an extra requirement, you know, without worrying about whether or not you form a contrail at this stage. Simply, can you set up your day-to-day operations so that this could be incorporated? And if so, what would be the consequences? What would be the difficulties? Because, I mean, I'm not suggesting for one moment that this is an easy thing to do. All I'm suggesting is, compared to making fuel out of thin air and, you know, waiting 25 years for a result, this is something that should be addressed now, and it should be serious, you know. And it also includes a group of people who otherwise would not be in this game at all. You know, we can't just leave this to Airbus and Boeing, because they can't solve this problem. You know, they can't do it. So, you know, it's a question of mobilizing another unit.
Thanks very much, Ian. Another question here, it's talking about getting awareness of this issue across to the public, essentially. It says, so what about non-contrail effects and the general environmental awareness, such as recycling, catering, aircraft packaging use, etc., which is really just tinkering at the edges of the problem, versus contrails, which should be the key focus. How do we get that message across?
Good question. We need to change the narrative, you see. It's not in the narrative at the moment. It's all about carbon dioxide. I mean, I've tried by writing, you know, articles that can be read by, well, not quite lay people, but close enough to sort of wave the flag. And we need to get this simple message out to a much broader audience somehow. I mean, there's a challenge, obviously, but you know, you guys are doing a sterling job. What would be the ideal outcome would be if government policy could be changed, because the government, in my view, has got its head firmly stuck in the sand, and is literally overlooking the obvious opportunity. You know, we're not asking for billions of pounds here. We're asking, you know, just for a bit of assistance to do something that's already happening on a day-to-day basis. And it's government policy. If we can get non-CO2 onto government policy, everything will change.
I'd like to add that it is kind of tinkering at the edges when you talk about plastic on board and reducing the weight of seats by 1 or 2%. But every little department can do their little thing. So we shouldn't also just ignore the fact that there's lots of plastic on board and the airlines are trying to do everything they can to reduce weight and reduce fuel. So whilst contrails is a huge thing, I mean, we need to do all these things in parallel. So recycling and catering off aircraft and packaging and things like that, everyone's got their own little niche market, which they can do. So whilst contrails is overridingly huge when you compare to CO2 and fuel burn and everything we've heard about today, that doesn't mean we can just say, oh, we should just carry on business as usual for metal on board and increasing weight of seats and amenity kits and plastic and all those sort of things. So everything should be working in tandem. But I think greater awareness, as Ian said, we need to get it onto the agenda. People need to discuss it because it is the overriding sort of problem at the moment.
Yeah, here we're focusing on the little stuff, but ignoring the big stuff. CO2 has to be taken out of aviation eventually. My concern is it can't be taken out by 2050, and something terrible will happen to the industry between now and then, unless we can produce an alternative strategy which clearly affects the global temperature problem, which is, you know, why we're having this discussion. But CO2 has to go eventually.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to emphasise that although this session is all about contrail avoidance, contrail management, the BALPA Environment Study Group and BALPA's position generally absolutely supports the decarbonisation of aviation as well. Both things have to happen. The difference, of course, is that decarbonisation is enormously expensive and enormously slow and enormously difficult. And we're looking at targets for 2030, 2040, 2050 before any meaningful change is likely to happen. Whereas contrail management can be started within days or weeks. It's so much easier to implement. So that's why we're focusing on it today. If you look at the BALPA website and go to the page balpa.org/positions, you'll find quite a comprehensive position paper that the group wrote, that's just been backed by BALPA's National Executive Council, that outlines our opinions on all these different measures. I've got another question here, which I think is probably best addressed to Roger, which is simply, if I can just find it again, will hydrogen-powered aircraft increase contrails due to water vapor emissions?
That's a very good question. In fact, yeah, we've done this simulation just last week, so I can share some preliminary results. Yes, you will increase the amount of contrails because the water vapor emissions are about 2-3 times more than Jet A fuel. But at the same time, the hydrogen aircraft are not expected to form as much particles because there's no carbon source, there's no soot, no NVPM. The particles that are activated are generally from background aerosols or with the potential for organic aerosols, for example, lubrication oil that's emitted from the engine. So if you assume that the fleet is replaced by hydrogen, don't cite this, it's still just preliminary results. The contrail energy forcing is expected to reduce by about 90%. Yeah, about 90% on the nominal scenario because the uncertainty is large. We ran different scenarios, but all scenarios, even the most pessimistic scenarios for hydrogen, you get a 50% reduction at least in the contrail energy forcing. So to summarize it, more contrails, but shorter lifetime, smaller climate impact.
But 20 to 30 years away.
Yes.
That's the if ever.
If the hydrogen source is clean as well, because
yeah,
we need to like figure out how to produce it in a green manner.
Well, you see, that's another story altogether, because if your SAF or your hydrogen is not made from green hydrogen, then the environment is worse off. The aircraft may not be producing the CO2, but the CO2 is produced somewhere else. So, yeah. But you're right. The only source of particulates in a hydrogen engine would be the burning of the oil. And I presume even that could be sorted out in time.
Yep.
But supposing we want to create contrails, Roger, then we don't want all these helpful, in inverted commas, technologies.
We're still creating contrails.
Not helpful at all.
Yeah. We're still creating contrails. So even if your engine is clean and there's no particles, the ambient aerosols, the background aerosols, will activate to form contrails.
Yeah. There are pictures, aren't there, of contrails forming in the low pressure regions on top of the wing. So you don't even need the engine, actually. You just need a pressure perturbation, and that can kick it off. Though I believe that's a very rare occurrence.
Yep, for current technologies, because it's predominant. So yeah, it's the easiest pathway for contrails to form with soot. But when that's removed, then the next limiting factor would be this ambient particles.
The other interesting question that I've not heard anybody speak of is, if you have an engine, a gas turbine operating on a hydrogen cycle, where the optimum altitude is, we know where the kerosene powered one is, it's just in the wrong place. But if you change the fuel, I have a suspicion that the optimum altitude will go higher, which again would take you out of the supersaturated regions, or tend to.
Thanks very much. We're running out of time. I was hoping to finish at midday. James is frantically typing away next to me, answering as many questions as he can. So if you open the Q&A box, you can see typed answers to some of them. There's just time for one more, and I really like this one because it's a really lateral thinking one. Dave Heaven would like to know, if we are deliberately making contrails during the day, would this not affect the production of solar power on the ground?
You mean that tiny little bit of energy that we managed to scrape together? Well, yes and no. I mean, it would have an effect, but it would be so small that you could forget about it. Since we don't harvest solar energy over the North Atlantic, so it wouldn't have any effect there. you know, but it's this, when you compare the scales, these are orders of magnitude difference. They're not just a few percent, they're thousands, if not tens of thousands of times different. So the answer is, don't worry, your solar panel will still warm your bathwater, I think.
Yeah, Ian, you're right. If we put numbers to your context, the incoming solar radiation is about, let's say, 1,000 watts per meter squared. The outgoing long wave radiation is about 250 watts per meter squared. If you add a contrail over Europe, it's only 1 watt per meter squared. So,
yeah, we can rest easy.
Oh, thanks very much. It's just, I'd never thought about that aspect of it. So for me, it was a really interesting question. Well, a big thank you to all three of the presenters today. It's been really interesting. I hope it's got all our viewers involved and excited about this concept. As I say, we will try and post these videos on both the BALPA and the GATCO websites, so you can have a look at them again, and you can send them on to anyone you wish. They should be publicly available. That's all from me. A big thank you. Please do tune in next Monday, 10:30 for the next session. You'll find the sign up link in the same place as you found this one on the email that was sent out to you from your company council or from your contact. Have a great afternoon, everybody, and goodbye.